In a quiet military base tucked away from the bustling city life, Lieutenant Taylor had always known that her path was different from others. She had joined the Army not just to serve, but because she felt a deeper calling. Growing up, she was surrounded by stories of courage, strength, and justice, stories she had always admired. They shaped her belief that true change could only come from individuals who fought for what was right. And now, as an officer in a respected unit, she was living that belief every day. Taylor's mission today, however, was one that would test everything she stood for. For weeks, the military and local authorities had been on the hunt for a notorious criminal, someone who had managed to evade capture by hiding in the underbelly of the city. The criminal had a reputation for being violent, and his crimes ranged from armed robbery to assault, and he had left a trail of destruction wherever he went. Taylor, with her sharp instincts and years of tactical training, had been assigned to lead the operation to capture him. It was no easy task, but it was one she had prepared for all her life. As she sat in her office reviewing the intel on the suspect, the phone rang. Her commanding officer was on the other end. "Taylor," he began, "we've received new information. The suspect's location is believed to be in the industrial district. You're going in tonight. Make sure you're ready." Without hesitation, she stood up, her uniform crisp, her mind focused. "Understood, sir. I'll mobilize the team and be there within the hour." The command center was abuzz with activity as soldiers prepared for the operation. Maps were spread across the table and everyone was assigned their roles. Taylor's team was small but efficient, trained for these kinds of operations. They all knew their jobs and had worked together countless times. But there was something about this mission that felt different. It wasn't just another criminal they were after. This was a man who had eluded the best efforts of law enforcement for months. They knew this would be a high-stakes operation. Taylor's mind raced as she briefed her team. "We move in quietly, no loud announcements. We don't want him to know we're coming until it's too late. We'll block off the exits and make sure we're not outgunned. I want every corner covered." "Any questions?" The team nodded, each member understanding the gravity of the situation. Taylor, though calm and composed on the surface, felt a familiar surge of adrenaline. It was the same feeling she had before every mission. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her, but it only fueled her determination. She wasn't just chasing a criminal. She was chasing justice. As they made their way to the industrial district in the dead of night, the city seemed quieter than usual. The streets were empty, save for the occasional car speeding by, their headlights cutting through the darkness. The cold air bit at their skin, and Taylor could hear the sound of her boots on the pavement as they approached the target location. The industrial area was a labyrinth of old warehouses and rusting machinery, a perfect hiding place for someone like the criminal they were after. The plan was simple. Surround the area, move in from different angles, and flush him out. Taylor's team took their positions, each member finding a place to hide, waiting for her signal. She was the one calling the shots, and she knew it would all come down to her instincts. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. Not tonight. She checked her watch. 10:45 p.m. It was almost time. Taylor took a deep breath, steadied her rifle, and gave the signal to move. Her team began their approach, careful not to make a sound. The lights of the warehouse ahead flickered in the distance, casting eerie shadows. Taylor's heart raced. She had been in situations like this before, but tonight felt different. There was something in the air, a sense of unease that made her senses sharper than ever. As they moved closer to the target, a sudden noise broke the silence, a crash coming from the warehouse on the far end of the block. It was the sound of something heavy falling, followed by the unmistakable echo of footsteps. Taylor's instincts kicked in. This was their chance. Without hesitation, she signaled for her team to move faster. The suspect was near. It was clear now. As Taylor approached the building, she felt a rush of excitement mixed with a pinch of fear. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The suspect would either surrender or fight back. Either way, she was prepared. She reached the entrance, her gun raised, her movements swift and calculated. The sound of her team securing the perimeter reached her ears. There was no turning back now. Taylor stepped inside the building, every sense heightened. The dim light of the warehouse revealed nothing but rows of old crates and steel beams. It was eerily quiet, too quiet. Her team spread out, covering every possible exit. Taylor kept her eyes on the shadows, waiting for any sign of movement. Suddenly, she heard a rustling noise from behind a pile of crates. Her heart skipped a beat. The criminal was close. Taylor motioned for her team to be ready. She took a deep breath and prepared herself for what was to come. This was the moment she had trained for. No room for hesitation. She had to act fast, but as she approached the crates, the unexpected happened. A group of local police officers, who had been assigned to assist in the operation, appeared from the opposite direction. Taylor's eyes narrowed. She had been briefed about the police presence, but they were supposed to be here already, coordinating with her team. Instead, they were late, and now they were in her way. "Lieutenant Taylor?" one of the officers asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. "We've got this covered. You don't need to go any further." "Stay back." Taylor's jaw tightened. She had dealt with law enforcement before, but there was something off about these officers. The way they looked at her, distrustful, even condescending, made her skin crawl. She was a soldier, trained and experienced, and this was her operation. But these officers, with their biases and egos, didn't see her that way. To them, she was just another woman in a uniform, and in their eyes, that made her less capable. "I'm the one in charge here," Taylor said, keeping her tone even but firm. "We're going in. Get out of the way." The officer hesitated, but finally they stepped aside. Taylor's eyes flicked back to her team, who had managed to position themselves around the building. She knew they had to act fast. They couldn't let this criminal slip away. As they approached the crates once again, Taylor's heart raced. She could feel the tension building. She had been in dangerous situations before, but this felt different. There was a strange energy in the air, something that told her things were about to take a turn for the worse. She pushed the feeling aside. She had a job to do. Then, out of nowhere, the sound of a gunshot rang through the air. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the warehouse, sharp and unforgiving. Taylor's instincts kicked in immediately, and her body tensed as she ducked behind a stack of crates. For a moment, everything went quiet. The world seemed to pause, holding its breath. Taylor's heart raced, the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She had no idea where the shot had come from, but she knew that the situation had escalated and fast. Her first thought was for her team. They were trained to handle these kinds of situations, but no amount of training could prepare them for the chaos that was unfolding. She scanned the warehouse with swift, practiced movements, her mind racing as she tried to figure out what had just happened. "Everyone, stay low," she barked, her voice steady despite the urgency of the moment. Her team responded immediately, their movements synchronized as they took cover and positioned themselves strategically around the building. Taylor knew that they needed to act quickly before things got out of control. The police officers who had been with her were now in disarray. The officer who had questioned her earlier was shouting something, but the noise of the ongoing operation drowned out his words. Taylor's eyes flicked toward him, her gaze sharp and commanding. He seemed to be panicking, and that only made the situation worse. "Stay focused," Taylor ordered, trying to regain control. She could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The mission had just shifted from a straightforward capture to a dangerous, unpredictable standoff. Then, she heard another noise, footsteps quick and heavy, moving toward the far end of the warehouse. Taylor's heart skipped a beat. The criminal was on the move. He had taken advantage of the chaos to make his escape, and now it was a race against time. Without thinking, Taylor signaled for her team to follow her. She moved swiftly, her boots echoing against the cold concrete floor as she navigated through the maze of crates and machinery. Her senses were heightened now. Every sound, every movement magnified in the stillness of the warehouse. The criminal was close, she could feel it. But just as she reached the corner of the building, something unexpected happened. One of the officers, seemingly unaware of the danger, rushed past her, his gun raised. Taylor's eyes widened in disbelief. What was he doing? This wasn't the time for reckless behavior. She opened her mouth to call out to him, but before she could say anything, another gunshot rang out. The officer stumbled back, his body jerking as the bullet hit him. A gasp escaped Taylor's lips, and she instinctively dove for cover, her mind racing. The situation had spiraled out of control. The officer, wounded but still conscious, fell to the ground, his hand clutching his side. Taylor's heart pounded in her chest as she realized the true danger they were in now. This wasn't just about capturing a criminal anymore. This was about survival. "Get down!" she shouted to her team, her voice urgent. They took cover immediately, but the chaos was far from over. The criminal was still somewhere in the building, and now the police officers were in disarray, unsure of what to do next. Taylor's mind worked quickly as she assessed the situation. The officer who had been shot needed medical attention and fast, but they couldn't afford to lose track of their target. She weighed her options in an instant, her decision clear. She turned to her team. "Cover me," she commanded. "I'm going after the criminal." Without waiting for a response, Taylor moved forward, keeping low to the ground. The warehouse was filled with shadows, the dim lighting casting long, eerie shapes across the walls. Every corner could be hiding the criminal, and every second counted. Taylor's breath came in short, controlled bursts as she navigated the maze of crates, her mind focused on one thing: finding him before he could escape. As she moved deeper into the building, she heard more voices, the police officers, still shouting orders to each other, their confusion evident. The criminal was getting further away. Taylor pushed herself harder, her legs burning as she sprinted through the darkness, her fingers tight around her weapon. And then, she saw him. He was running, his silhouette just visible in the dim light of the warehouse. Taylor's heart surged. This was it. She raised her weapon, her breath steady despite the adrenaline rushing through her. She aimed, taking in the distance, her finger just about to pull the trigger. But then a loud, unmistakable voice interrupted her. "Stop! Right there!" A police officer shouted from behind her. Taylor froze, her heart skipping a beat. She hadn't expected this. She turned around, her gun still aimed at the criminal, and saw the officer, one of the same ones who had questioned her earlier, running toward her, his hands up in a gesture of authority. He was shouting at her to stop, but there was something off about the way he was moving. The distrust in his eyes, the hesitation in his steps made Taylor's stomach turn. "Get out of the way," she shouted, her voice sharp. She couldn't afford to let the criminal get away, not now. But the officer didn't budge. He was getting closer, and his expression was one of confusion and fear. "Don't make this harder than it already is," the officer called, his voice rising. "You're putting everyone at risk." Taylor's mind raced. This was it. She was the one in charge, not him. She had the criminal in her sights, but now, the very people who were supposed to support her were standing in her way. The weight of the moment felt almost unbearable. She knew what needed to be done, but these officers weren't making it easy. "Move," Taylor shouted, her voice cold and commanding. "You're not in charge here. Step aside." But as she took a step forward, her world suddenly went black. The sound of a gunshot rang out, and she felt an excruciating pain in her leg. The force of it knocked her to the ground, her vision blurring as she tried to process what had just happened. She could hear the muffled voices around her, but they seemed far away. Her body screamed in pain, but her mind was numb. Was she shot? Had the officer fired? She tried to move, to push herself up, but the pain was overwhelming. She could taste the metallic bitterness of blood in her mouth. Her head swam as she tried to focus, but everything was spinning. "Taylor!" she heard someone shout. It was one of her team members. He was kneeling beside her, trying to help her, but everything felt like it was happening in slow motion. The world around her was blurring, her thoughts scattered. The officer who had fired, the one who had been so quick to intervene, stood nearby, his face pale with shock. The situation had escalated beyond anyone's control. Taylor had been hit, and now there was no turning back. The world felt like it was collapsing around her. The pain in Taylor's leg was unlike anything she had ever felt. It was sharp, searing, and relentless. She could hear the chaos swirling around her, shouting, running footsteps, the sound of radios crackling to life, but everything felt distant. Her vision was blurred, and her breath came in ragged gasps. Despite the pain, one thought pierced through the fog in her mind. This can't be happening. She had trained for situations like this. She had prepared herself for everything that could go wrong during an operation, but being shot in the leg by someone on her own team was something she never imagined. "Hold on, Lieutenant. We're gonna get you out of here!" The voice that called out to her was familiar, one of her team members. He sounded far away, his words muffled as if they were underwater. Taylor wanted to respond, to tell him she was fine, but the words wouldn't come. All she could do was focus on the pain, on the searing heat in her leg, and on the overwhelming feeling of helplessness that washed over her. As she lay on the cold concrete floor, trying to steady her breathing, she could hear the officer who had shot her talking to the others. His voice was shaky, almost frantic. "I didn't mean to. I thought she was going to shoot. I thought she was the criminal." The words made Taylor's blood run cold. He thought I was the criminal? She could hardly believe what she was hearing. She had been leading the operation, working tirelessly to track down the dangerous criminal, and now one of her own team members had shot her because of his own fear and lack of understanding. Her vision began to clear, and she saw her team member kneeling beside her, his face etched with concern. "Lieutenant, stay with me. We're gonna get you help." Taylor tried to focus on his face, but it was hard. The pain was almost overwhelming, and the shock of what had just happened made her head spin. The officer who had shot her was still nearby, but now he was being pulled away by other officers, his hands raised in surrender, his face a mask of regret. "Don't move her!" someone shouted. It was another one of her team members. Taylor couldn't see his face, but she could hear the urgency in his voice. "We need to stop the bleeding first." A few of her team members were already working on her leg, applying pressure to the wound, trying to control the bleeding. Taylor's mind raced, trying to keep herself calm. She couldn't let herself slip into unconsciousness, not yet. She had to stay alert, had to stay in control. "Don't worry, Lieutenant," one of the medics said, his voice soft but steady. "We've got you. Just hang on." The sound of sirens in the distance told her that help was on the way. The ambulance would be there soon, but the pain in her leg felt like it might tear her apart before they could get her to safety. Her thoughts drifted, and she found herself thinking back to the beginning of the mission. The early excitement, the feeling of purpose, the tight-knit teamwork. She had worked so hard to get to this point, and now everything was unraveling before her eyes. The team had been ready. They had trained for months, prepared for every possible scenario. But this was different. She had never imagined that the greatest threat to her life would come from one of her own. As the sirens grew louder, Taylor's thoughts turned to the criminal. Had he escaped during the chaos? Was he still out there, free to harm others? She felt a surge of frustration. She had failed. The mission wasn't complete, and now she was lying in the cold warehouse, helpless and wounded. But then something unexpected happened. Her team, the ones who had been with her from the start, were still there. They hadn't abandoned her. They were working together, keeping her safe. She could feel their presence, their determination. They wouldn't let her down. She had to hold on, for them as much as for herself. The medic spoke again, his hands gentle but firm as he worked on her leg. "We've got the bleeding under control. The ambulance will be here soon." Taylor nodded, her thoughts still cloudy. But the more she thought, the more she realized that she couldn't give up. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. As she closed her eyes, trying to block out the pain, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching. She opened her eyes to see a figure standing above her, her commanding officer. His face was grim, his eyes hard, but there was a flicker of concern in them as he looked down at her. "You're going to be all right," he said, his voice low. "Just hold on." Taylor nodded again, unable to say anything. She didn't have the energy. She was too exhausted, too hurt. But she knew that her team would do everything in their power to make sure she pulled through. And then, the ambulance arrived. Taylor woke up in a hospital bed, the sterile smell of antiseptic filling her nose. Her leg throbbed constantly, the pain pulsing like a heavy drum with every heartbeat. At first, she couldn't even remember how she got there, and the haze of confusion made her eyes dart around the room. Machines beeped steadily, monitoring her condition, and a soft rustle of activity came from the nurses outside her room. The painkillers had dulled the edge, but her mind was sharp, replaying every detail of the warehouse, the mission, the criminal, and the chaos that had ended with her being shot by someone who should have been on her side. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness forced her back down. Her commanding officer appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of concern that Taylor had rarely seen. "Easy, Lieutenant," he said softly. "You've been through a lot. Just rest for now." Taylor's jaw tightened. Resting wasn't what she wanted. She needed answers. Why had the officer fired at her? How had things gone so wrong? She needed to know whether the criminal had been caught. "What about him?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "Was he caught?" Her commanding officer sighed heavily. "No, he got away in the chaos. We tried to contain him, but with the shooting and confusion, he escaped. The police? They made things worse, Taylor. We've never seen anything like this." Her stomach sank. All the preparation, all the months of tracking had gone up in smoke. But more than the mission, it was the betrayal that hurt. She had trusted them. They were supposed to support her. Instead, fear and bias had turned them against her in a split second. As the days passed, Taylor began her slow recovery. The doctors were firm. She would be on bed rest for weeks, maybe months. Her leg would heal, but the wound was deep, and there was a risk of infection. Despite the physical pain, her mind raced constantly. She couldn't focus on anything else. The shooting wasn't just an accident. It had been a moment born from prejudice. She felt anger and disbelief mingling with frustration. Her team visited her daily, bringing updates from the field. They spoke cautiously at first, aware of how raw the situation still was. "Lieutenant," one of them said, "the investigation into the police officers is underway. Everyone knows what happened. They're not getting away with it." Taylor wanted to believe that, but a part of her worried. She had seen the system before, seen how power and prejudice could bend rules. She didn't want to hope too much, but she couldn't ignore the possibility that justice might not come quickly, or at all. The media had gotten wind of the story. News reports began to surface about the female Army officer shot by police while trying to apprehend a dangerous criminal. Some reports praised her bravery, calling her a hero. Others focused on the chaos, questioning how an operation could go so wrong. Taylor couldn't help but feel conflicted. The public didn't know the full story. They didn't know about the tension, the distrust, and the fear that had erupted in that warehouse. Her family tried to support her as best they could. They visited regularly, bringing meals, flowers, and words of encouragement. But Taylor could see the worry etched into their faces. They knew that this incident wasn't just about her physical injury. It had left deep emotional scars. She felt isolated in ways she hadn't expected. The Army had trained her for danger, for violence, for physical pain, but not for the betrayal of those she trusted the most. One afternoon, a senior investigator came to speak with her. He explained that they were reviewing the officer's actions in detail. Body cam footage, witness statements, and radio transmissions were all being analyzed. "We're going to get to the bottom of this," he said. "We need to understand exactly what led to this shooting. Racism, bias, panic. We have to know which played the biggest role." Taylor listened carefully, nodding. She appreciated the effort, but the thought of reliving the incident in testimony filled her with dread. The officer who had shot her wasn't just a colleague gone rogue. He represented a systemic issue. Taylor had faced prejudice in subtle ways her entire career. Now it had exploded in a moment of violence. Despite the physical pain and mental strain, Taylor refused to remain passive. She began working with her legal team and senior commanders to ensure that the officers responsible would be held accountable. It was a delicate process. She had to balance her recovery with the demands of the investigation. Each day brought new reports, interviews, and discussions, and the weight of responsibility felt heavier than ever. Her relationship with the police department became tense. Meetings were filled with icy stares and careful words. Some officers expressed regret, others defensiveness, and a few outright hostility. Taylor could see how deep the divisions went. Some were unwilling to acknowledge the role of bias, instead framing the shooting as a tragic mistake. She knew the truth was more complicated, but she also knew that justice required clarity, accountability, and courage. The community around her began to react as well. Advocacy groups, journalists, and citizens began speaking out, calling for transparency and reform. Taylor found herself at the center of something much bigger than herself. While her initial mission had been to capture a criminal, the incident had now sparked conversations about racism, accountability, and the treatment of women in uniform. She didn't ask for this attention, but she realized she could use it to push for real change. Days turned into weeks, and Taylor's physical recovery slowly improved. She could move her leg with the help of crutches, though pain remained a constant reminder of that night. Her emotional recovery was more complicated. Nightmares visited her frequently, replaying the shooting, the chaos, and the criminal slipping away. She struggled with trust, with the fear that the officers responsible might avoid justice, and with the knowledge that she could have been killed simply for being a woman of color in uniform. Yet, in the midst of all this, Taylor found resilience. Her team remained her anchor. Each visit reminded her that she was not alone. Their support fueled her determination to not let this incident define her. She refused to be a victim in the narrative. If anything, she would turn her experience into a force for awareness and reform. Her commanding officer visited often, sometimes offering guidance, sometimes simply sitting with her in quiet solidarity. "You're stronger than most people know," he said one day, "not just because of what you've survived physically, but because you've survived mentally and emotionally." "That's rare." Taylor absorbed his words quietly. She knew he was right, but it didn't lessen the weight of anger and frustration that lingered. She had survived because of her training, her instincts, and her courage, but the wound in her heart ran deeper than the wound in her leg. The investigation continued, drawing attention from military and civilian authorities alike. Taylor gave statements, recounted her perspective, and provided every detail she could remember. She demanded transparency and honesty from everyone involved. Slowly, evidence began to paint a clear picture of what had happened that night. The officers' actions were scrutinized, and discussions about racial bias, judgment under pressure, and accountability began to take shape publicly. Despite the physical and emotional pain, Taylor never wavered in her determination. She could feel that change, however slow, was beginning to take root. She realized that her fight was no longer just about capturing a criminal or healing from a bullet wound. It was about justice, truth, and using her voice to ensure no one else endured what she had faced. It had been several months since the shooting, and the echoes of that fateful day still haunted Taylor. The months spent in recovery, both physical and emotional, had been long and painful. The battle within her, between holding on to hope for justice and the overwhelming sense of betrayal, was a struggle that never fully subsided. But she had always been resilient. That's what had kept her going. The investigation into the shooting had been thorough, with evidence building a case against the officers involved. But as the day of the trial approached, Taylor felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. This was not just about her anymore. It was about something bigger: accountability, justice, and the uncomfortable truth that too many people in positions of power had failed to confront their biases. The courtroom was tense. Taylor sat at the witness stand, her posture straight, but her heart pounded in her chest. The sound of her own voice felt distant as she recounted the events that had led to her being shot. She had relived the experience countless times in her mind, but this was different. Speaking those words aloud in front of so many people made it real in a way she hadn't anticipated. The defense attorneys were doing their best to twist the narrative. They attempted to paint her as reckless, quick to escalate the situation, and blamed the chaos on her leadership. But Taylor didn't falter. She told the truth, not just about what had happened that night, but about the systemic issues that led to the mistrust, the prejudice, and the eventual violence. "Why did you feel the need to go in alone?" one of the defense attorneys asked, trying to undermine her decision-making. Taylor looked him in the eye. "I didn't go in alone. My team was with me and we were all prepared. The officers who were supposed to support us were the ones who failed. They were the ones who acted out of fear and distrust, not professionalism." The defense attorney scoffed, but Taylor's gaze remained steady. She had already spent too much time doubting herself. Now she was speaking for the people who had been silenced, for the women who were overlooked, and for those who faced prejudice simply because of who they were. In the days that followed, the case grew more complicated. Public opinion was split. Some saw her as a hero, a symbol of strength who had fought against injustice even in the face of her own suffering. Others pointed to the chaos, questioning how an operation led by the military could go so terribly wrong. The media had a field day, taking sides and picking apart every detail of the trial. Taylor tried to tune out the noise, but it was hard. She had never wanted this kind of attention. She just wanted to do her job and do it well. Now her name was being tossed around in debates about systemic racism, law enforcement, and military accountability. Through it all, her family remained her greatest support. They came to the trial sitting quietly in the back, offering silent strength. Taylor had always felt their love, but now, seeing their faces in the courtroom, she understood just how much they had been through as well. It wasn't just her that had been affected by the shooting. It had rippled through everyone who loved her. The turning point came when a key witness took the stand. A former officer, someone who had witnessed the events of that night, spoke out. He had been one of the first to arrive at the scene after the shooting, and his testimony was a game changer. He described the confusion, the racial biases among some of the officers, and the panic that had led to the disastrous decision to shoot Taylor. It was the moment that many had been waiting for, the confirmation that the shooting wasn't just an accident, but the result of deeper systemic issues. Taylor felt a mix of relief and anger as she listened to the witness. He was speaking the truth, but the reality was painful. She had been right all along. The problem wasn't just one officer or one mistake. It was a pattern, a culture that needed to change. The case wasn't just about her injury anymore. It was about the millions of people who had faced similar discrimination and injustice. Taylor realized that the fight was bigger than her. She had become a symbol of something more profound: the need for accountability, the fight against racial bias, and the struggle for equality within institutions that were supposed to serve and protect everyone. As the trial came to a close, the jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity. Taylor sat in the courtroom, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the table in front of her. She couldn't focus on anything else. She had given everything she had to this case. All she wanted now was justice for herself and for everyone who had ever been wronged by the system. The jury returned with their verdict, guilty on several counts. The officers who had been responsible for the shooting were held accountable for their actions, though the sentencing was far from what Taylor had hoped for. Still, it was a victory. It wasn't just a personal victory. It was a victory for everyone who had been marginalized, silenced, or oppressed. In the weeks that followed, the military and the police department began to implement changes. There were discussions about reforming training protocols, addressing racial bias, and improving communication between military and law enforcement during joint operations. Taylor wasn't sure how much of it would actually be put into practice, but she was willing to keep pushing. Her recovery was slow. The physical scars would fade, but the emotional scars would take longer. There were still days when she woke up feeling the weight of what had happened. The nightmares came and went, but they didn't define her. She had learned that strength didn't mean being invulnerable. It meant rising despite the pain, despite the fear, despite the setbacks. Taylor returned to duty, not because she had to, but because she wanted to continue fighting for the changes that were needed. She had always believed that justice wasn't just a word, it was a process. It was a constant effort to make things right, even when the system was stacked against you. As she walked back onto the base for the first time after the trial, a sense of determination filled her. She was still that woman who had put on the uniform, who had dedicated herself to protecting others, but now she had a new purpose. She had seen the flaws in the system, and she was determined to make sure they were addressed. The road ahead wasn't easy. There would be more battles to fight, more challenges to face. But Taylor had learned something crucial. She didn't have to fight them alone. Her team, her family, and her community were with her. And together they would push for change, for fairness, and for a future where no one else had to suffer the way she had. The air was cool as Taylor stood at the edge of the training field, watching the soldiers run their drills. It had been a year since the trial, a year since the shooting, and the weight of everything that had happened still lingered in her heart. She had healed physically, though the scars, both visible and hidden, remained. The emotional wounds, however, were not as easily mended. They had left their mark, but she had learned to carry them with a quiet strength. Her time in the hospital, the months spent recovering, had given her space to reflect. She had gone through every stage of grief, anger, denial, and finally acceptance. But what had become clearer with time was that this wasn't just about the shooting anymore. It wasn't just about her injury or the officers who had fired that fateful shot. It was about something much bigger. She had become a part of a conversation that was happening on a much larger scale, about racism, about accountability, and about the need for change within the very systems that were supposed to protect people like her. The changes in her life were subtle at first. Her team, who had supported her during the investigation, had become a constant source of strength. But more than that, her role within the military was beginning to shift. Taylor found herself taking on more leadership responsibilities, not because she sought them, but because others recognized her resilience, her determination, and her ability to inspire. It had taken time, but she was no longer just the officer who had been shot. She was now an advocate, a voice for those who had been wronged, and someone who was committed to ensuring that what had happened to her would never happen again. One afternoon, as she sat in her office, a message popped up on her screen. It was from a senior officer who had been involved in the post-trial reforms. The subject line read, "We need you for the next phase of training." Taylor clicked open the message, reading the contents carefully. The military had decided to implement new training protocols for officers, with a special focus on preventing racial bias and improving the way military personnel collaborated with law enforcement. They wanted Taylor to be part of a task force that would design and lead these training sessions. It was a big responsibility, but it was also a chance to make a real difference. For too long, the military and police forces had operated with little understanding of the implicit biases that affected their decision-making. Taylor knew firsthand the dangers of unchecked bias. This was an opportunity to change things from the inside out. She didn't hesitate to accept. The first day of the new training session was unlike anything Taylor had ever experienced. The room was filled with high-ranking officers, many of whom had never been asked to question their own biases. They were there to learn, but Taylor could see the skepticism in their eyes. They were there because they had to be, not because they fully understood the importance of the task ahead. As she stood at the front of the room, addressing the group, Taylor took a deep breath. This was her moment to make an impact. "Let's start with an exercise," she began, her voice steady. "It's important to understand that we all carry biases, whether we're aware of them or not. Today we're going to confront those biases head-on." The exercise involved a series of scenarios where officers were asked to make split-second decisions, but with a twist. Each scenario had been designed to challenge their assumptions about race, gender, and authority. The reactions were mixed. Some officers were defensive, reluctant to admit that they had made decisions based on bias. Others were more open, but the discomfort in the room was palpable. Taylor knew this wasn't going to be easy. Changing the way people thought, especially those in positions of power, was never simple. But she had seen how important it was to have these conversations, to push through the discomfort and make people think about their actions, their words, and the assumptions they carried with them every day. As the day progressed, Taylor watched as some officers began to open up, even if only a little. It was a start. She didn't expect miracles overnight, but she knew that each session, each discussion, was a step in the right direction. That night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. She had gone from being a victim of violence to a symbol of strength, and now to an active participant in changing the system that had failed her. She had never imagined her journey would take her here, but in a way it felt like the most natural next step. There was a knock at her door, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was one of her team members. "Hey, Lieutenant," he said with a smile. "I know it's been a tough road, but you're doing something amazing here. People are listening. You're changing things." Taylor nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and determination. "Thanks. It's not easy, but I have to keep going." The next few months were filled with training sessions, meetings with lawmakers, and discussions about how to implement systemic changes within the military and law enforcement. It wasn't always smooth sailing. There were setbacks, pushback, and moments of frustration, but Taylor refused to let that deter her. She had come too far to stop now. She remembered what it felt like to be disregarded, to be dismissed, to be seen as less than. But now she was using her voice to ensure that no one else would have to face that same injustice. Taylor's story didn't end with the trial or the training sessions. It became something more, a movement. The conversations she had started began to spread. She spoke at conferences, wrote articles, and participated in panels. Her name became associated not just with the shooting, but with the fight for change. The support she received was overwhelming. There were people who had followed her journey, people who were inspired by her strength, and people who were ready to join her in the fight. Taylor found herself surrounded by a community of like-minded individuals, people who had faced their own battles and were now ready to stand together to bring about change. Years later, as she stood on stage at a national conference, receiving an award for her efforts in reforming law enforcement practices, Taylor took a moment to reflect on how far she had come. She was no longer just the officer who had been shot in that warehouse. She was a force for change, a leader, and a symbol of resilience. None of this would have been possible without the support of my team, my family, and every single person who stood beside me through the darkest times, she said into the microphone, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I didn't choose this path. It chose me, and I will continue to fight not just for myself, but for everyone who has ever felt silenced, dismissed, or left behind. This is just the beginning. The applause that followed was deafening, but for Taylor it was more than just recognition. It was the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where she no longer just reacted to injustice, but actively created the change she had always dreamed of.